All right, looks like we're live, everybody. Welcome. It's 3 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday. This is the day when we draw together. So this is Drawing Together. My name is Scott Maier. We're here with Artist Network, again, where we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So this is the subject we're working on today. These avocados. It was a great photo. Really simple subject, but I think in many ways some of these simple subjects can provide really interesting challenges. And so that's what this show is all about. I've got my hat on today because it's been a horrible hair day. And so I'm hoping that it's not going to interrupt the stream at all if I don't want to cut into the shot too much. But again, these simple subjects provide really unique opportunities for us to develop skills in particular ways, and that's what the show is all about. So if you do want to follow along, you can find the reference image in the description below. You can also share your work when you're done at artistnetwork.com. You can find a link there in the description, as well as pinned to the top of the chat here. So I love to hear all of your comments, observations there. Share your thoughts and questions about drawing, about art in general. This is about us all getting together to draw together. So share what you're willing to about your whole process. I'm going to talk through what I do, and hopefully you can share your thoughts as well. And feel free to push on my process in any ways if you see something that looks off, or if you have a suggestion for a technique or a process or a way of thinking about drawing that could help me and everyone else. That's what the show is all about. So let's do it. Oh, thanks for the comments about the hat. This is my favorite hat. I used to wear this. I wear this every day for like 10 years, and then I kind of got out of the habit of wearing it, so it feels good to have it back on. All right, so welcome everybody. I'm going to get to it. I need to make things a little bit larger so I can actually see your comments. If you do have questions that you would like me to address as close to real time as possible, if you type those questions out in all caps, it helps me to identify it and separate it from the general chatter. So Brenda has a question. Please recommend a good smooth paper for graphite. On the note, let me go through the materials. So Brenda, what I'm working with today, this is actually a Legion bamboo paper. I really like this as a surface for graphite. It has a slight tooth to it, and you'll see that actually you can kind of see that in this preparatory drawing, the tooth of the paper is showing up here. I think it accepts and releases the material very well. So if you haven't worked with a bamboo paper, you might give that a shot. Again, this is the Legion bamboo paper. So if you go to legionpaper.com, I believe is the site, check that out, and you might try to find something there. But otherwise, I prefer on graphite a heavier weight paper. Graphite really works with a variety of surfaces, however, and so as always, I kind of recommend experimenting and trying what works for you, the way you work with material. And there's just all these subtle ways in which my camera cut out. My camera cut out for a second there, but there's all these subtle ways that the paper and the graphite can interact with one another, and you want to find what's particular to you. But like I said, I've really enjoyed these bamboo papers for graphite. So the graphite that I'm working with today, I have the set of Cezanne pencils from Jerry's. These are the creative market that I really enjoy. They're very soft. The hardest one I have here is my HB, and I have a 5B, which is going to serve as my midweight, and then I have a 12B for my darkest darks. Now part of that, I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, part of the reasons I have a bias towards some of the softer materials is for the benefit of the camera that's overhead. It just shows up a little bit better. So if you feel like all of your pencils are harder, that's fine. I think it's going to work out just fine for you. I also really just enjoy the soft graphite. I like that it can move around so easily on the surface. Aaron said, bad hair day, is it purple? No, it's just it's kind of laying flat here today, but I have very straight hair that sticks up some days, and that's exactly what was happening. It just turns into a big poof on the top of my head, and it was distracting for me. So hopefully that answers your question, Brenda. Let's see, other materials I'm working with. I have this Derwent retractable rubber eraser that I enjoy for some of the fine lines, and this is the Vanish eraser made by This again comes from Jerry's. That's this one right here. It's a soft rubber that works really well. It lifts a lot of good material. Plus my trusty Kneaded eraser here, which we use quite regularly, and my blending stump. And as you can see, I've been manipulating this. This is just a paper towel that I'm going to use for kind of wiping down the drawing as I go. So that's what I'm working with. I do have this accurate a mechanical eraser that that I might end up using. That hopefully that showed up. I don't know what's going on, if it's actually showing up. My camera is kind of flickering in front of me and it's a little distracting. So I think it looks like it's actually not flickering on your end, but we'll go for it. Okay, back at it. Oh no, it does come out. Oh darn it. Okay, so what I'm looking at over here is I have this, I have my other monitor up here, and that's where I'm looking at the chat. So, and I also have a larger version of the reference. I recommend working from a smaller version of the reference. A small thumbnail helps to eliminate some of those details. And I don't know why that's cutting out so frequently, but it's really distracting. So I apologize for that if that's... Hopefully this camera seems to have resolved all the issues that I've had before, so we'll just keep working on this. So where was I? Reference images. I'll walk you through my process here. Let me know how you all do it. If you have any questions. As many of you know, my preferred method is to kind of build from a gesture. It's all about refining a gesture for me. And so it, and kind of aligning the drawing process with the evolution of our observations. And so with this initial pass, we're really just familiarizing ourselves with the subject, and it can be helpful to have either a few versions of the reference image, you know, a small one and then maybe a larger one for the details, or, you know, really practice, you know, squinting and interpreting the reference image in a variety of ways. So these initial attempts, right now my eyes are all out of focus. This is really distracting. I'm going to switch camera sources here for a second. Okay. Because that was really distracting. Oh, geez Louise. Okay, there we go. I apologize. I don't know what's going on with my equipment today, but that should be a more stable picture. Okay. Now I got to get my head in the game. That's what drawing's all about, right? That's the process of drawing. Part of what we're doing is to take a break throughout the day. I know my mornings are full of any number of activities and things, and so drawing just helps to bring me into focus. It kind of gives my brain something else to focus on, kind of quiet down, and yeah, just kind of go from there. So hopefully that picture is better. Yeah, so that I'm seeing some comments about that. Yeah, I have a program that I use that uses my phone as a webcam, and for whatever reason that signal was not coming through properly. All right, so again, I'm reacting to the form. There's no kind of preset flow that I go through in any subject in this early stage. This is all about just kind of simply reacting and allowing my mind to identify the areas of the drawing, and kind of it's leading the way right now. So I'm not thinking about structure or anything at this point. I'm not thinking about process beyond simply just allowing myself to react to the subject and simply get information on the page. And then as we drop information on the page, we're going to gradually adjust it. So, and you can see I'm using this overhand grip because I want to use the side of the pencil. I want to minimize the amount of lines that I'm putting down here and think about larger masses and shapes. Think about basic value relationships. So I'm just looking at, there's a dark kind of shape here as we come across here. That's not the pit of the avocado, that's just a large dark shape. There's dark shapes under here that kind of move in this general direction. That's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. Trying not to think about these as avocados, because when I do that, it brings into my mind any sort of preconceived notion about how to draw it or what an avocado should look like. The other advantage to working on it with a quick gesture at the beginning is that it allows me to see how everything's going to align on the page. And at this point, I can look at it and say it's not quite fitting properly. Everything feels like it's a little bit lower down than it needs to. I don't have quite enough space down here to really render the bowl there. So it's where this paper towel comes in handy. And then with this smooth paper, it helps to really kind of soften these marks. And so we're going to kind of build up the drawing, we're going to smooth it out, we're going to build it up again and then smooth it out. And each time we're going to move towards greater accuracy and a greater degree of refinement. So now I can kind of take that previous drawing experience, learn from it, and move things around on the paper. I have that kind of faint ghost image of that initial pass on there that I can use to help orient myself. It can be really helpful to move, intentionally move your eyes back and forth between the surface and the reference image and kind of get into that habit. If you're kind of new to drawing, one of the things that it can often be challenging is that we get accustomed to putting all of our focus on the page. It's like we'll take a quick snapshot of the subject. We'll understand that subject in it's kind of a split second. And then our drawing will then kind of shift to the paper, and we'll just be looking at the paper, reacting to what's happening on there, all the while building that image from that quick snapshot of that initial kind of glance at the subject. And so it can be helpful to intentionally bring your gaze up to the subject matter, to the subject, and not get absorbed in what's happening on the page, if that makes sense. I don't know if any of you have that experience or I've had that. I know I have for sure many times. You just kind of get absorbed in the mark making and then realize that it's been a long time since I've looked at this subject. What am I actually drawing, right? And in this way, what we're trying to do is we're using drawing to better understand the subject. The better we understand the subject, the stronger the drawing. And so they kind of go in hand. All right, so that feels like it's going to fit on the page a little bit better. And then as we get more information on the page, we can start to adjust it. Tammy's saying needs cataract surgery. I hope that goes well for you. I'm glad the squinting helps a lot. I've been kind of thinking a lot about that, just kind of paying attention to, throughout the day, what my eyes are doing. And I realized that so much of my day is spent with my eyes really relaxed and out of focus. And I'm not sure exactly where that comes from, but I found that I end up relying on that a lot throughout the drawing process. So right now, everything is just blurred and out of focus for me. I'm not necessarily squinting, but I do have kind of a soft focus applied. I'm just letting my eyes relax right now. And I don't know if that's a habit that comes out of drawing, or again, it was a habit that I did before, that I had before that I applied to my drawing, but all right, so again, still just trying to kind of reacting. I haven't done any sort of mental calculation about the proportions here, but what I'm trying to do, and through the squinting helps, is to again try to see shapes of light and dark as not defined by the object itself. So if we look at these two halves of the avocado, one way you could look at that as two distinct shapes. But if you let your eyes relax and you just focus on shapes of light and dark, you realize that down here, for example, there's this dark shape that is a merging of those two halves of the avocado. There's a dark shape here that represents that kind of concave shape of left over from the pit that kind of merges with this shape over here. And there's this general dark shape here that starts to merge into here. And so that's where my focus right now is, on the unification of those forms rather than creating a division of those two halves that will then later go in and shade and try to merge together. So that's just my own preference for working, but it may be very different from yours. You may be choosing to kind of create an outline and then fill it in and then look to merge those areas. One of the other areas I'm looking at is when I squint and I let my eyes lose focus, there's this shadow here, the form shadow on the bowl, that merges with the cast shadow on that placemat. And so it becomes kind of this abstract dark form here. So what I'm looking for are these larger unified shapes that we're going to gradually subdivide as we gather more information about this subject. So, hello Zeffy from South Texas. Hello everybody. If you're new, I'd love to hear where you're viewing from. And I want to welcome you to the group. We have quite a few of us that gather together from around the world, again, simply to draw every week. I've enjoyed getting to know all of you and to hear your suggestions on subject matter that we might tackle. One thing that I'm doing right now is that I recognize that I was kind of getting in the habit of a diagonal motion that aligns with the natural movement of my arm, just kind of going like this. And so I want to shake that up, provide a little bit of contrast. One of the things we talk about a lot here in the show is paying attention to the direction of your marks and how they might be used to establish spatial relationships between the objects, and how you can use it to create more spatial contrast in the work. All right, so at this stage we can start to see kind of a ghostly image of the form, and I'm just going to take initial stock over it and see, is there anything that stands out as being wildly off? I think at this point I'm pretty close. Now I can start to make increasingly refined decisions about the proportions. And so this is where I might kind of just make some tick marks here. If I indicate the far kind of left side of that bowl and then the far right, we have a few dimensions that we can look for. I think what I need to do first is find the axis to that bowl. So I'm trying to visualize an axis running across here, closing one eye, aligning my pencil with the reference image right behind it. So I'm placing this directly over the reference image in front of me, finding that axis, identifying that angle and locking this wrist so I don't move it, and then placing it directly on top of the overhead camera projection of the drawing here. So I'm establishing an angle here, and I'm just going to put it on the page. If I use a light overhand grip like this, I can lift that mark easily later. But that axis will be helpful. And let me see, I'm actually going to try to find an axis for each of these halves. And that there's really kind of it's just a gut feel for that. I think some of you might actually look at some of these objects and identify the central axis as being slightly different than what I do. So go with that. I mean, that's part of this drawing process, is to allow yourself to kind of discover your own way through the drawing. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm giving myself a little bit more information on this lower side to help me see this shape in here. This feels a little bit too close, and part of that I think is just because I need to start to do some subtractive drawing, some negative drawing, to capture that light on the lip of the bowl there. And that'll help me to see the dimensions of the bowl a little bit more clearly. This is also a good time to remind you all about kind of the practice of indirect observation. And so if you have the ability to place your reference image adjacent to your drawing, then what you're gonna do is you're gonna practice looking at your reference image but putting your awareness on the drawing. And then while you're drawing, have some of your attention on being placed on the reference image, kind of looking at the two at the same time. And it can be really uncomfortable. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts around that or questions, but that's so much of what happens is, so right now as I'm making these marks, I'm actually looking at the reference image, but I'm putting my awareness on the drawing right next to it. I'm seeing what you're seeing, the same screen that you are. And so I can see the reference image and the movement of my hand out of my peripheral vision here. And that's largely what I'm doing. And I'm glancing at the page just periodically to make sure that I'm generally in the right place. But I think, and then when I'm staring at the actual drawing and I'm seeing my pencil moving, I have part of my awareness on the kind of the simplified shapes of the reference that I'm seeing out of the periphery. So, and if you start to move your eyes quickly back and forth, it can sometimes help you to identify something in your drawing that needs to align more closely with the reference. So hopefully that makes sense. Oh, Tammy, you're going to be doing this on brown paper. That is awesome. I'm excited to see what that looks like. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some angle sighting to this to help correct the curves that are starting to emerge here. So this bowl itself is elliptical. It seems fairly irregular. So I think where I'm going to first place my attention is on these points of intersection. So right here where the bowl cuts behind that avocado in the foreground. And I'm going to try to evaluate the angle of the avocado in contrast to the angle of the bowl there. And the way I kind of think about these marks is I'm using an overhand grip kind of intentionally because it creates a fairly fuzzy line. It's kind of broad and fuzzy, and that gives me a little bit room to maneuver. So I'm kind of gradually getting closer to an accurate capturing of that line. But right now I don't know exactly where it needs to be placed. I'm just trying to get a little bit closer. So a fuzzy line like this can be helpful, and I can sharpen it up later. Now, in this process here, you might physically try to transfer angles from your reference photo to your drawing. So I'm going to do that here. I'm looking for this angle here, aligning my pencil, placing it directly on top of the reference, and then carrying it over to the drawing. So in this way, creating that shape as a sequence of short straight marks. Oh, the avocado emoji there. I didn't realize that was a thing. So, and now this, one of the things that I found myself being challenged by in the preparatory drawing for this is thinking about the pit as a sphere when it isn't. And that was really hard for me because I felt like every part of my drawing process was driving me towards creating a sphere here. And what I found was that it led me to creating a very generalized understanding of that pit. It was not as specific as I would like it to be. And so I had to force myself to really kind of see that specific shape. So using angle sighting, trying to break that form down into sequences of shorter, straighter marks can be helpful. And now at this stage, I'm also looking at the negative space. So evaluating the distance between this edge and this edge, this edge and this edge here, for example, just kind of moving around and asking myself, am I generally in the right place? And I haven't done any specific measuring or calculation as part of this yet, but hopefully I'm in the ballpark. Oh, Karen is asking what pencil am I using now? I forgot to mention that. This is the HB that I'm using now. So this is the hardest one that I have. Now as I move across here, I have this, again, this general shape. I need to start making that a little bit more specific. And so the first area I'm going to look for is that point of intersection. So right in here, find where that hole there intersects with that top edge. And then I might, before I come around here, rather than work all the way around, now I kind of worked across this way. Now I'm going to come down here and see at what point does this curve intersect here. And it makes me realize that what I need to do is kind of define this edge of the avocado a little bit more. And to help me place that point of intersection, I'm going to carry a horizontal guide across to see where it intersects here. So it feels like it's right about here, where that intersection is. I'm going to keep that light because actually that's going to be a light edge. I'm going to erase out that light here. Realize that gets confusing. There's a difference between kind of a lighter value and a light touch, and I kind of confused those points. So now what when I was saying earlier, I was using a light touch to indicate a dark mark that will then be light by subtractive drawing. So what I was intending to articulate. All right, now we can move up here as well, looking at this distance, try to evaluate that distance, seeing where that intersection should be between that background avocado section, where it intersects here. So I get really excited by subjects like this because the forms are just really interesting, and especially as you get in and you study the nuances and the particular shapes. You know, sometimes I can feel like, well, I don't know, I need to do a subject that is more, that is more symbolic, carries more weight to it. But then look at this avocado and I'm like, man, there's a lot of cool stuff happening in here. So it can sometimes be interesting to challenge yourself with what you might consider a boring subject. All right. Now, you know, we're moving up here. You can see that we're moving from intersection to intersection, coming across here. Now we have this intersection point where the bowl emerges from behind the avocado. This feels like it's coming out a bit too high right now. So if I bring this down where it feels like it needs to be, one of the things I have to be aware of is how it might impact our understanding of the path that's being obscured by the avocados, right? So we have, as part of our visual system, you know, our brain is solving that problem for us. We're really good at connecting the paths of things that are obscured from view, knowing that, you know, that this bowl passes behind here and it doesn't just fall away, but it actually continues through, and it should have a logical exit point on this side, or vice versa. So I think it's important to kind of pay attention to that, so that it doesn't just kind of confuse the brain, and it also kind of aligns with its natural ability. So one of the things that also I start to observe now is that if I'm comfortable with the proportions here, this distance here is too wide relative to this half of the avocado. There's a spacing, kind of a rhythm, where this gets a little bit narrower, and then this end gets even narrower. Now, before I make a declarative statement about where the edge of the bowl is on the left-hand side, I want to double check the width here. So if this becomes something that I'm basing my measurements around, I need to make sure that it's correct. I need to make sure that this is correct. So I'm going to take some time to evaluate that now. So how am I going to do that? All right, well, let's see, we have this dimension here that we can look at, and I can compare. So that seems about correct. So if I take this distance from the edge of the bowl to the edge of the avocado here, it's equivalent in distance to this placement on the pit of the avocado. So let me carry that across one more time. One. And then I should be able to take this measurement across. There's 2. Let me see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to see that if this becomes my base unit and I'm measuring across 1, 2, 3, 4, I want to compare that to the reference photo. There's 1, 2, 3. And that actually feels really good. That's just to the left of this edge of the pit. And then I'm going to take one more measurement across, see where that lines up. And that puts me right here, just past that intersection point. 2, 3. And I'm seeing that. I'm happy with that. 1, 2. And then one more measurement across. So this, I've basically made this distance here my base unit of measure. I'm comparing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so the 5th mark here, and I'm going to measure across the 6th here. The 6th on my drawing takes me all the way across to the far left side of that avocado. So I'm going to compare that to my reference image. And actually it looks like it lines up. So that makes me feel a little bit more confident that I've placed, and I've placed the avocados properly, and I've generally arrived at a proper proportion between them. So now if that's all locked in, I can look at this distance here and realize that I need to bring this edge of the bowl in a little bit closer. And what I'm measuring now, based on the reference photos, that base unit, another measurement should actually put me to the edge of the paper, edge of the reference photo right about here. So the paper I have is a little bit too wide. I haven't really paid much attention to the margins here, and I've actually shrunk everything down a little bit. I'm going to keep it that way rather than expand my drawing now so that it exactly matches the reference. I have all the proportions in here. They're comfortable, they're relating to one another well, so I'm just going to shrink everything in proportion to one another. So what that means is that this edge of the bowl kind of goes away, and I need to redefine it. First, looking at that point of intersection here, that point of intersection here, and making sure that I have a generally the axis for that bowl correct. It feels like it's generally correct. So still using the HB pencil. Use the paper towel to kind of smooth this out. One of the challenging things to working with a paper towel like I'm doing here is that sometimes it can really kind of highlight any fingerprints on the page. So that happened to me yesterday. I had grubby fingers on my drawing, and then I wiped it down with my paper towel, and all of those fingerprints showed up on the surface. I'm just trying to get rid of some of the distracting blotches that emerged. And I just kind of worked that into my process. I realized that, you know, there was a long time in my drawing process where I felt like I was constantly fighting against smudges and trying to keep everything clean. And it just felt like an impossible battle. And so as a result, I've just kind of come to embrace the messiness in the early stages of the drawing and then worry about cleaning it up later. So that line there is a little hard. I need to soften that because it's distracting. So when I'm softening, I'm just using my kneaded eraser, just kind of tapping and lifting off a little bit and then smoothing it out. Okay, now back to this curve. So I'm going to try to find an average angle for this section of the curve. I know it's a smooth curve, but if you can visualize it again as a series of short straight marks, you can arrive at something that is very specific. Okay. And that's true in subtractive drawing as well. So using this eraser to kind of lift off the edge of the bowl. And you can see that I've lifted off a mark that is too wide. And that's all right, because I can then cut that back in. You know, I can work additively and refine that edge by working up to that edge on both sides. Right. So in this way, we're working both additively and subtractively throughout the whole process. I'm kind of curious if anybody came across this drawing having searched how to draw an avocado, because I realized, I don't know as if I've ever considered that as a search term. If you are, and you're specifically looking on how to draw, looking at how to draw an avocado, I'm kind of curious what's underlying your motivations. So. All right, so I think I'm going to, again, just soften. The way I conceptualize using a paper towel like this is unifying. Got all these marks on here. I'm just going to try to unify the drawing a little bit and switch to, let me put the HB over here to the 5B. That's my next darkest one. Deanne Webb is saying ellipses are always the problem for me. You make them look so easy. I think my drawing will not get the placemat. Yeah, I ignored the placemat as well, largely, because that's a lot of concentric circles. Yeah, I hear you on overthinking the curves. I think what I want to do is kind of shift my thinking now to the bowl. And, you know, we have a general organization of our lights and darks now, when we can start to refine those. And what I'm observing here is how the mat under this section of the bowl is darker than here. This is in shadow, but it gets even darker right in here. And so what I need to do is make sure that I'm placing that dark mark relative to the avocado pit here appropriately. And then we arrive at the base here, this thin sliver of the base of this bowl that we are just barely able to see. And I dropped a kind of a light guideline in there, but I'm really trying to tackle this through the use of shapes and values. And as you may be observing, rather than kind of move just directly across, I'm kind of bouncing around back and forth, because there's a shift in the brain that happens when we progress in a kind of a linear fashion around the contour of an object. It's very difficult in that moment to hold in your mind both the specific qualities of the section you're working on, as well as how it fits into the larger whole. So if I'm working on this section, for example, I'm thinking about the angle, the basic value, etc. If I move down to here, I'm thinking about the angle, the basic value, and kind of general proportions. And I can move along and keep thinking that way. But when I'm focused on each section at a time, I can't at the same time be thinking about that whole section here. And so as a result, I'm intentionally jumping around back and forth to try as best I can to hold in my mind the entirety of the drawing and the subject, rather than any one specific form at this point. And then once I'm really confident in the totality of it, that the overall proportions and the basic value structure, then I can isolate an individual section and just focus on that specific area without worrying that it's all going to fit together. Hopefully that makes sense. Squinting, again, really helps. Squinting prioritizes value relationships. And one of the things that I suggest is that if you're looking at a subject, your subject, and you have a kind of a sharp focus applied to it, and then you squint your eyes and an edge disappears, that's an indicator that the values are actually more similar to one another. And that's really relevant when you're working from life or whether you're working from a colored reference image. Those colors, the saturation and the hue of those colors can impact our interpretation of the values. And so that's why squinting becomes an effective tool, because it prioritizes the value relationships in our minds, and it helps us to overcome any sort of kind of direction the hue and the saturation of that color might have, the influence that they might have on how we interpret the values. If I don't know if that makes sense at all. But sometimes a highly saturated color can feel lighter in value than it actually is. And so squinting helps to reduce that saturation, and you see the true value of that color, the lightness or darkness of that color more accurately. And so paying attention to the edges is really a valuable thing, because when you squint at a subject and an edge disappears, that tells you that those value relationships are actually closer together. Or if an edge really pops off, then you see that a value contrast is perhaps higher than you might initially understand it to be. So I don't know if that was a bit of a tangent, but what I'm trying to do is understand the general shape of this cast shadow here. And so squinting is helpful in seeing that, because it's such a soft and subtle transition in here, but if you squint, you start to see a more defined shape. And so I'll do some, some subtractive drawing, looking at the negative space here, the negative shapes that are formed in the space around the bowl. Yeah. All right, kind of lost my train of thought there. But I think what you're perhaps starting to see in my process is that I've been enjoying the idea of kind of starting off with these kind of ambiguous forms and then gradually refining them and bringing edges into focus a bit more. Next week we're going to be working on a portrait, so I was working on that, and I think that's going to be a key element in the drawing, is creating a sense of atmosphere, out of which the portrait emerges. All right. So I'm still using this overhand grip because I don't want any hard lines. And one of the keys to an overhand grip here to create these broad areas of value is to rotate your pencil as you go, so then you're gradually you're kind of rounding it out. You're not developing these flat spots on there. I do think I need to give myself a little bit more information along in here. So this angle feels generally correct. And now what I need to define is that sliver of value in along here where that base of the bowl emerges. So if I give myself an indicator, I can drop a plumb line here to see where it intersects that section of the avocado, and that generally looks correct. So one of the reasons that we're doing this, we draw every week, is to help build hand-eye coordination. That's really where it started for me. Like I realized that I was spending so much time painting outdoors that I hadn't really dedicated much time to continue my drawing practice, and that in practicing drawing, it helps me to develop my hand-eye coordination so that I can kind of pick up the pace when I'm working outdoors. I speed up that process. And how that often manifests is being able to look at the reference and more quickly arrive at the correct placement of that object on the surface. It can take time, because we're often kind of influenced by these impressions of things that are sometimes inaccurate. And as we start to analyze those impressions and question them, we arrive at more accurate drawings. And I want to be careful to use the word accurate, because that's how I don't want to say better or worse. You as the artist are going to be in control of what qualities you want to be primary in your work. Is it about the accuracy, precision, hand-eye coordination? Is it about expressiveness? Is it about the subject? There's so many things that art can be about. One thing I worry about is that, it's easy to define, and kind of place quality on work that is kind of quote unquote correct, right? But that may not always make great drawing. There are a lot of great drawings. I look at Van Gogh, for example, and some of his drawings that are inaccurate in some ways, and it's in the inaccuracy that makes them powerful. So I don't want to make the impression that accuracy is the ultimate goal in all cases. In the case of simply trying to build hand-eye coordination and focus on just kind of developing a practice like we're doing here, accuracy can be helpful because it gives us a target. We're trying to develop hand-eye coordination, and so that'll manifest in whether or not in comparing the drawing to the reference photo. But so something that's been on my mind lately is trying to figure out what is the hierarchy that we build in our minds around how we want our work to be perceived. Is it the technical ability? Is it skill that wants to be the primary reaction, to generate the primary reaction? Or is it the subject matter? Is it the emotional quality of the marks? You know, there's so many things that can drive the response somebody has to a work of art. I'd kind of be curious, what are some of the things that stand out for you all? What is it that you most want to communicate through your work if your goal is to share it with other people? And maybe that your only goal is to create work for yourself, which is mostly what I do. So I think there's a lot of value in just doing work for yourself. But I don't know if that's a bit of a diversion, but. Oh, Brenda's saying, how do you keep your kneaded eraser clean? I don't. This is very dirty, but I was using one yesterday that was fairly old, and I didn't knead it before I started drawing, and it left a bunch of dark smudges. So the way to keep your kneaded erasers active is to knead them. And so they're designed to be used like this, you know, twisting and pulling and stretching, and in that, it keeps them active. This is an eraser that I've been using regularly for over a year and a half now. Pretty much every week I've been using this eraser. And so they can last for a very long time, but kneading them it's kind of part of keeping it active. And if you let it sit for a long time, sometimes it can get dry and you might have to kind of work it a bit to soften it up a bunch. So. Oh, Diane B13 has a question of what is the value of continuous line drawing? I find it very difficult. That is a fantastic exercise, and it's one that I don't think we've ever done here, but it's one that you'll find in books like Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, right? The real value in that, and if you don't know what that is for everybody, a continuous line drawing is one where you place your pencil on the page and you're looking at the contour of an object. So the contour is the line that represents the edge of a three-dimensional object. And with a continuous line drawing, what you're doing is you're placing it in one spot and you're moving along and not lifting, and you're never going back. You're moving through the entire drawing as one continuous line. And the value there can be in really slowing down the brain and being very deliberate about how your pencil is moving. It helps to develop hand-eye coordination, and it gets you to think strategically about the subject in an interesting way. Now, it's not one that I do a lot, but it's one that I would that's often how I would start off a drawing class, is by doing that. It introduces artists to the idea of really putting that attention on the subject matter, because in my mind, to really get the most value out of a continuous line drawing, your eye stays fixed on the subject, like a blind contour drawing. So a blind contour drawing is one where you're looking at the subject and you're creating a drawing without being able to see the page at all. And then when I assign a continual line drawing assignment, then that paper comes in, so you can actually see out of your peripheral vision the lines that you're making, but you're trying to keep your attention fixed on the subject. So you follow along the contour and you move intentionally and simply allow your drawing hand to react to your observations, but you do have the ability to see the page and kind of check in with that. So hopefully that makes sense. And that's where I find the most value is in that, and really helping to establish the relationship between putting time and awareness on the subject versus your drawing. It helps to break a habit if you get in that mode of, again, taking a mental snapshot of the subject, going to your drawing, and never really looking back to kind of evaluate your understanding of the subject, if that makes sense. All right, Tammy, get ready for that birthday. And Susan is saying, I make art for my own pleasure, and if someone likes it better, it makes me feel awesome. I actually put in lots of my own emotions. That's awesome. So that's, yeah, if anybody else has how they share, I think it's been on my mind a lot lately, because I think sometimes we can make the assumption that we're all doing work and we're all sharing our work and it coming from the same place when it may not be. And it can be helpful sometimes just to step back and kind of ask ourselves, where is this all coming from? And how might that impact our interpretation of it? All right, so I've kind of darkened this area. I'm going to leave it, it's a little bit darker than it needs to be. Where am I going now? Let's see. I feel like I don't know where I'm going with this drawing right now. So what I'm going to do is, in order to keep moving, I'm going to switch to an area that's a little bit easier. So like this area down in here. And you can see I'm trying to be intentional with the direction of my marks. This motion is really easy, it's natural, but I want to turn it this way. I want horizontal marks in here to help align with the horizontal orientation of that ground plane, the largely horizontal orientation of it. And these, I'm using overhand grips, so they're very fine marks, but if there's any sort of expression of the direction of those marks, if anything, I want them to be horizontal. So I'm trying to kind of contort myself into that. So just kind of laying it down. This bamboo paper works really well. It creates these nice smooth gradations. I can soften right in here if that's getting a little bit too distracting, if I need a more gradual transition. If you're looking for a smooth area of value and you're finding it blotchy, what you might try doing is target the light areas, kind of fill those in, and then smooth it out. Identify other light areas and then smooth it out. And there's a kind of a distinct tooth to this paper that also, when I'm smudging, I'm applying a little bit more pressure to really kind of get it in that surface. And now, one of the reasons I chose this paper specifically is because of the tooth. I can actually use the texture, the tooth of the paper, to help with the texture of the avocado. And if I'm going to use that to my advantage, I need to create a little bit of contrast. So I want this area to be smoother so that I can save the tooth of the paper for some of the texture later on, and the kind of the avocados, kind of both the pit and the outer, is it a peel? I guess, I don't know. Yeah. Susan from Humboldt, awesome. Yeah, and Diane B13, you bring up a good comment there. That, yeah, it makes it good sense. I have to go through the ugly stages and have patience. Yeah, we haven't talked about that. The ugly stages, the ugly duckling phase that drawings go through. That can be, I don't know, challenging to deal with. And Greg is saying, I think my art is about me translating my appreciation of landscape and architecture into the page in an attempt to convey that appreciation of it to the viewer. Greg, I'd say, based on the work that I've seen, that's landing pretty well. If you haven't checked out his work, check out Greg's architectural drawings. Are really, really amazing. And I think, for example, that there is something conveyed in the mark making that shows a kind of an intense appreciation, I think is a good word for it, for the forms, and not just the form of the building, but like you said, the way that building and the architecture, the landscape kind of come together as one experience. So, all right, so what am I doing now? I like the soft quality of this drawing right now, but I need to bring in some focus. So I want to bring in some sharp focus right in here. And I think what I want to do is start in this area. And I wish I had a reason for it that I could really articulate, but I don't. I think it's just really just where I feel compelled to bring some sharpness to it. All right, Tammy, I'm glad the elbow is healing. I can't wait to see your drawing. So if you are new and you're just joining us, together with Artist Network, where we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. We're drawing this avocado, and you can draw along too if you bring up the reference image. It's in the description below. You can also share your work, because if you want to, you want to put it out there. I think it can be a helpful thing. All right, so we're talking about refinement, and I think it's important to remind myself, and if it's helpful for you, perhaps, to continue with that same thought process that we've had so far. In that you can see I'm going to move around the drawing and not get locked in any one area too much. So I'm kind of gradually refining some of these areas, and I'm not erasing yet. I think in general my inclination is to build up, continually add value, continually add material to the surface, and then wait to erase. And I kind of, again, it came to that through years and years of processes where if I'm looking at this edge, for example, my initial instinct would actually be to sharpen it with an eraser, and then I would kind of draw in the darker areas. And then I'd realize, oh, it's too light in value, so now I have to darken it, and I just have to apply graphite to the area that was already darker to begin with, but I had erased out. And so I found that I have a natural kind of bias towards lighter values. And so I'm intentionally forcing myself to just put more material on the page, go darker, 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 and then lift out the lights from there. Because value is relative. We're always calibrating our understanding of values based on the relationships we see forming on the page. And so something might feel darker than it actually is until you build up other values that you can compare it to. So that's where my default process is to go darker and then lift if I need to. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, so right in here, we talked about creating a contrast and texture. This is an area where I can bring out the blending stump to kind of refine this area. Now, the blending stump is smoothing out the texture, kind of filling in that tooth, but we always have an opportunity to contribute to the form. So I'm actually just going to draw with the blending stump for a little bit. It's already loaded pretty well with graphite, and I can always pick up more in some of these areas. But ask yourself, as you're doing this, how can I continually refine some of these forms here? And it becomes a really effective way of creating some of those subtle marks on the edge of the avocado here where the knife cut through it. And now really for the first time in this drawing, becoming aware of that shift in value across the surface here where it's darker along that edge. Now, one of the tricks to working with these blending stumps, it can get really kind of blotchy sometimes. So trying to have a consistent pressure to it, just kind of start with just the weight of the material first. And I'm going to use these circular motions to help soften. And there's a rhythm to the marks where you're going kind of in and out with a light pressure, and you're always rolling as you're going around. So if I slow it down, really what's happening is this type of thing where I'm rolling it in my fingertips and I'm doing large and small circles. And then if you know you want to apply some directionality to the marks, you can kind of lean in on it a little bit more to create some of those marks. I know, but like I said, it can feel a little uncomfortable if you haven't worked with them before. Like I said, they can kind of create some blotches that are challenging to manage. And so those are some of the strategies that I use to navigate that. Let's see. Zephy said, mainly my art is in fiber collage. Oh, that's awesome. But I find drawing and painting improves my ability to see value and interpret it in a fiber piece. That is really cool. If you are so inclined to share your work, maybe on Artist Network, that could be interesting for us to see. All right, I'm seeing an issue here. This feels too wide to me. And so now I need to do a kind of a quick check-in. First, I'm going to compare this light here to the pit of the avocado over here. It should probably align with this. I think it just needs to come down a little bit more. So I'm going to actually darken this. I'm going to just get rid of that. And bring that light down. Now this light is really an interesting form, and this is something that I think will translate to a lot of subjects, and this is where sometimes working with a simple subject like this can be really valuable. And so if you look at this light, it's catching here on the inside of that bowl that's formed in the pit there. But then as we come up along here, it really represents the edge of that, and kind of the rim along that edge. And so what that means is that a little bit softer in here as we're seeing into that bowl a little bit, and then a harder edge along in here where we see that that light catching on the rim. And then you can come back in with your pencil and work up to this and kind of refine that edge a little bit farther. And what's nice is that it's a fairly irregular edge. So we can, it's not just a smooth kind of oval shape. So as I'm working in this area, darkening this, I'm looking for it to be a smooth transition and working kind of from the center of the form up to the edge to find kind of a sharper edge. Using these circular marks to create a smooth gradation. And then what I'm observing is that, light coming in here, this avocado is casting a subtle shadow in here, so it gets a little bit darker right in here. And I'm kind of ignoring this edge of the avocado. I'm going to build that in on top. And I'm doing that because this I know is going to be darker than that. So I have a little bit of wiggle room. I can just draw this darker shadow right in over the edge of the avocado, and then it will, I can go darker even again with this one on top of it, and that it creates a nice kind of smooth transition, so I don't have to be super precious with this edge over here. So there's a little bit of strategic thinking there, and trying to think ahead of what's going to be coming next. There, dig that. Monica J says, could you explain how you made the pit hole look deep and the pit look round? Yeah, so I'm going to get into that. That's a good thing to focus on. So a lot of it is just, again, trying to think of the reference image as an abstract form. Just look at just shapes of light and dark. Squinting also helps. I'm trying to get the shape generally right, And so in this case, part of what's creating that depth is really the relationship between that. There's a subtle shift in value here, a little bit darker here. You get a little bit of reflected light in here, right next to it. And then it gets darker again as we kind of curl up along the edge here. And then when evaluating that, what I want to do is squint at this now at the drawing and say, if I squint at this section and I see a distinct contrast between light and dark, that means there's too much contrast. And so I'm actually going more subtle. Right now I feel like I found an appropriate balance there, but that's kind of part of what I'm looking at in order to create the depth. And then now to bring this surface here forward, I'm looking at the areas where the light might be striking. It seems to catch a little bit more on that inner side here of this rim. There we go. And I'm seeing what I'm looking for. When I study the reference, these subtle shapes of light that are showing up here. So hopefully that makes sense. Now this doesn't quite feel round yet, but what's going to create a sense of volume in the pit is that contrast between the light up here where it's quite strong, you get that highlight, then into the shadow side. So then observing two things at once, the distinction between generally light side and shadow side, so blocking in the shadow side. And once you've established just that primary contrast between light and shadow, then you can go into the shadow side and find all the subtle variations of value within that. It gets darker in here, for example. There's a little bit of reflected light in here. We get another shadow core, a darker area right in here. And then, but it all starts from that primary distinction between light and shadow. And then you get into here on the light side and you can observe some of the subtle values there. Sometimes what can flatten out a drawing is when you maybe draw the shadows first and feel like you got everything locked down without really establishing the highlight, or vice versa. So you kind of work both of them at the same time, thinking about the large, just again, that basic contrast of light and shadow before looking at the subtle variations. All right, so I'm going to, I think what I want to do is resolve this area here a little bit more. So you can see I brought that light right in here. I didn't provide any room for the volume of the avocado here. This is where I'm going to go actually shift to the 12B because this is going to be fairly dark. I'm going to use the side of the pencil and use the tooth of the paper to help capture all those bumps and that texture of the skin. And now what I was talking about with value relativity, I was really seeing that as dark. And now that I put something darker next to it, now it feels lighter, quite a bit lighter in value. All right, so as I work my way down in this area, I want to be mindful of the fact that in the reference, I have a hard time distinguishing the edge of the avocado in this section. It just falls into that shadow. So I don't want to create a definition there that doesn't exist. Just because I know that edge of the avocado to be there doesn't necessarily mean I need to draw it. And I'm going to prioritize kind of a sense of light and atmosphere here by letting those forms just kind of merge together. So I'm kind of contorting myself a little bit. This curve is a nice gentle curve, and so using the natural bend in the wrist can be helpful. But always check in with the reference image so that we don't just trust, again, that natural curve of the wrist. We want that to be a specific curve based on our observations of the avocado. Avocado is a fun word. So riding along here, one of the other things that I'm fighting right now is the urge to make that a sharp edge. In the reference photo, it's actually quite subtle along that edge. It gets dark. The flesh of the avocado kind of merges with the other soft interior. So just kind of defining that edge a little bit more. And as we come down here, I'm looking at that skin of the avocado, and it's catching some bounce light in here, and you can actually see some highlights. So where it gets darkest is right up here along the edge, that cut edge, and then it starts to trail off. It gets really subtle, so I want to make my marks really light here. And again, using the tooth of the paper, so in this overhand grip, the side of the pencil is just scraping across the surface and just catching on the tops of the tooth of the paper, and is leaving these light areas that I think work well to suggest the reflected light off the skin. You can see now how I've kind of left that a bit. I think I might need to add a little bit more value down in here to help it kind of emerge from the base of the bowl. And then I think there's a little bit more value in here, a little darker. I'm going to let this be as it is, and then bring this edge of the avocado forward to help really push the spatial definition there. All right, Leah, glad you're enjoying this. You're saying subject is always a primary motivation, but now I also focus on interesting shapes and composition. Yeah. Well, you're welcome, everybody. Oh, I see a question, but it looks to be in a language that I cannot read. I apologize for that. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of suggest some of the texturing along here. And a lot can be described simply just kind of tapping on the surface and letting it scrape across the surface here. And so let's see. And again, intentionally moving around the drawing. So I want to address this section in here, and it gets tricky because you have these two curves that merge together, and so I want to clearly identify where that intersection point is relative to the avocado. And based on the reference photo, it's right below, just about this section of the avocado. So right about there is where they meet, and then that will help to direct the quality of the curve in here. And this is where it's a kind of a strategy for stepping back a little bit. If I had just kind of followed along this curve going from section to section based on how it feels, I could have ended up way over here rather than over here where it intersects the bowl, if that makes sense. And again, I'm going to kind of lean in on the material up along this edge. That helps to bring that edge forward. And as we roll underneath, maybe allowing some of the tooth of the paper to show to suggest some reflected light. All right. And now I'm going to come out here. It's going to emerge from behind the rim of the bowl right about here. So I'm using the larger reference image now to give me a little bit more information. And now edge variation, line variation can be really helpful. So this is a very thin mark here, and what I want to avoid is creating an even, consistent mark here. I mean, if that's the creative direction you want your drawing to take, then go for it. But if you're going for a sense of kind of realism, light, and likeness, paying attention to the edges is really an essential thing, and having variation along there really helps to create the illusion of light and volume. Again, that's not always to say that that's what every drawing needs, but if that's your objective, you want to pay attention to that. All right, so I'm going to switch back to the blending stump and kind of capture some of the smooth, fruity quality of the avocado in along in here. And I'm observing there's kind of stronger light here that I'll lift off. Now, one of the things that can be also helpful here is I need to kind of capture the overall value relationships of light and shadow effectively. And again, there's light striking here, but there's also highlights along in here. And I want to get the relationship between the highlights on the pit correct relative to the light here. And what happens is if I just focus all my attention on this area, I'm going to see it as being lighter in value than it actually is. And so then I run the risk of having two areas that are just they're competing with one another. I want to make sure I really understand that value contrast. So this area, the highlights here are the strongest. So I want to lift those off and give myself a little bit of context. So if that's the lightest I can go, I think I actually need to go a little bit darker with this area here. And I have to say that I'm feeling really uncomfortable doing that. I feel like I'm making it too dark. But I need to trust that observation right now. I'm just going to go darker. And then my hope is that it makes that highlight stronger and it puts it into a proper context, when we compare the two together. And again, that's because of the way our brains interpret value. We're always putting those values in a context, and that context is always changing. And so as I darken areas in the rest of the drawing, it affects the interpretation of the light values as well. And I think what I need to do is actually go darker back in the background. I'm going to switch back to the HB and go darker back in here. Again, to create a little bit of contrast. So it's not as dark as the darks in the skin of the avocado, but it allows me to create a little bit more contrast so that area here feels lighter. So much of drawing is that it's, in my mind, I'm actually drawing this, but I'm drawing it by putting marks here, if that makes sense. At least that's the way my brain wraps its head around this concept. So I'm just gonna kind of darken this area here, let it get a little bit lighter towards that end. I don't have to go very dark there. And then smooth it out with a paper towel. And see if that creates the contrast, that sense of light here a little bit better. And the thing is, with value, we tend to be quite sensitive to very subtle value relationships. And so what can happen is that because we are aware of the distinction between subtle values, we have a desire in our drawings to make that observation clear. And so we often will overstate that value contrast. And the way I try to think about it is, if we're good at seeing subtle value relationships in the actual object, then we're going to be good at seeing subtle value relationships in the drawing itself. We want that the drawing to be just as subtle as the original subject. And you know, I haven't made that clear in this subject, but I think whenever you can draw from real life, from, you know, set up your own still life with an avocado versus this reference photo, it's just going to give you more opportunity to build some of these skills. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with drawing from a photograph, but again, if we're putting ourselves in charge of our own artistic growth, there are things that when working from life, there are things that you can use to really boost your skills. But there's always something to learn from, even from working from a photograph as well. But there's something to kind of think about, are those subtle value relationships. And if you find that you have a bias towards kind of heightening that contrast in your drawing, really practice on creating very subtle shifts in your paper to see how far you can push that. What will the audience recognize? What is too subtle and what is too explicit? All right. Barb's gonna make guacamole tonight. Awesome. Go for it, Jackie. I wish it would be a fun party to have, is to set up a still life and then eat it. So one of the things that I'm observing now, doing a quick check-in on the proportions before I've locked this down. Let's make sure that I have it generally mapped out properly. And I feel like this negative space is too great. So I am going to reassess that a little bit. I think this needs to come down here a bit more, this edge. And what I think is going to be important here is to, now that we've seen the overall shape, is to study the subtle interactions between these, between all of these curves. So what we have here is this generally kind of a dark ring around the pit where it's kind of inserted into the avocado, and that kind of wraps around here, and then this right here is the edge of the avocado pit kind of emerging up from it. And you know, when you squint your eyes and you see that as a shape, it just looks like one shape right here. Now that we have that shape generally placed properly, we can analyze those curves and make sure that they fit together in a way that makes sense and extracts a bit more information about the form of the subject. Now, I'm also observing that there's a very subtle value relationship here. Those highlights here almost merge with the kind of a slightly darker value right in here. So I'm not going to draw a line there. So going back to that question about how to create form and volume, a large part of what's going to create that volume is how we use our line to define the edge of this contour, the edge of the pit. So, oh, Leah's translation from Russian, why are you wearing a cap? I'm wearing a cap because my hair was not cooperating today. I have that, I don't know, my hair just does its own thing. And what I was finding is that when I was setting up, my hair just kept falling in front of my face and making it really challenging. So I said, I'll just put my good old cap on and go from there. All right. Okay. So back to this. One of the things I'm observing is this reflected light in here. And I can feel myself wanting to make that very clear and explicit, but I know from experience that if I make that too intense, it's actually gonna flatten out the form. So I'm squinting at the form, and I want to make sure that I get this shape here. I want to refine this shadow shape, this form shadow here, before I create that reflected light. So what I'm doing is actually creating, this isn't as dark as I'm going to go. I'm going fairly dark, kind of an average value for that shadow. I'll smooth it out a little bit. I'll use my blending stump. Now there's some texture on the pit, and then as I'm smoothing out this average value, I'm going to start to kind of be aware of some of that texture and along in here. It's almost like there are these stripes that kind of crisscross that form. So now what I'm doing is I'm paying attention to this edge. This is what's called the line of termination, or the terminator. And that's the section, the region of an object where we transition from light onto shadow side. Light side, shadow side. That line of termination is that where it divides. But that line is often a very soft and gradual transition. And so that's what I'm looking for right now, is that subtle transition. And then as I work up to this edge, I'm seeing that then this part of the avocado is darker than the edge. So switching gears, doing some negative drawing here to define that edge a little bit more. All right, and so now I want to evaluate, is that overall value correct? I don't know, I forgot that little line there shouldn't be there. I'm going to try to start to think about that volume. Now we'll create, now that this whole area feels like it's in shadow, I'll go even darker. I'll find the darkest areas and leave this area to be the shadow, the reflected light there in the shadow. And one thing I'm observing along this edge is the way there are these kind of ridges in the pit that are kind of wrapping down behind and here. So this is, now what we're looking at here is what's called the cross contour. These are the marks on the interior of the form, inside the contour. These are the marks that define its three-dimensional form. So kind of thinking about how these marks wrap up and around that form. Right in here, the shadow core becomes deeper, and it leads up to a really nice dark edge along in here. And now we can start to see some of that reflected light forming there. And I haven't lifted any of that out. I haven't drawn the reflected light. I've simply created an average tone for the shadow. And then I'm creating that appearance of the reflected light by going darker in the shadow core areas around that reflected light. And if that is not quite enough, then I can come back in with a kneaded eraser and lift off some of this light here. I don't know if that makes sense or not. I don't know, is that something that you all have kind of thoughts or experience about? Like, it's something that I've certainly seen a lot, and I've done a lot myself, is overstating that reflected light. And again, it goes back to that, our natural ability to see subtle value relationships. And because we see them so clearly, we have a tendency to overstate them. Darken this area a little bit more. And then I think I need to establish this edge just a bit more. Just in a few areas, let it kind of emerge out of that value. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my sharpened rubber eraser here and just refine this edge a little bit more. So I'm kind of placing it along this edge where I want it to be, kind of then dragging away to create a crisp edge, and I think that will hopefully make it pop off a little bit more. But I'm being careful not to do that down here where it meets, where they intersect. I'm doing that up here to help pop this edge forward. So this part of the avocado actually cuts behind the pit a little bit. All right, and then in here I'll try to lift off some of that highlight again. And then what I can do along in here is there's little glints of light that kind of glisten in there. I'm just using the eraser to just along that edge. It's a really fine line to sharpen that edge, but I'm evaluating it to see if it's popping off or if it's competing with the highlights there, because I don't want it to compete with those highlights. I do think I want to kind of push this a little bit more, so I'm going to lift a little bit of the drawing along this area, lift up some of that value. In this case, I'm just scraping across the surface with the eraser, and that allows some of the tooth to play a role in there, and leaving some of those kind of bold marks to, again, to create a little bit of contrast against then the texture of the pit. And then I think what I need to do is I'm going to let that sit and then move on to the bowl a little bit. So what you can see that as I'm working on this shadow, I'm trying to be mindful of the cross contour here, the fact that that bowl really kind of scoops up. So I'm changing the direction of my marks. Let's see, HB, gotta get rid of that. Here we go. And then in order to create a sense of volume in here, looking for that subtle shift in value within that shadow shape. So similar to what we did in here, I'm averaging the shape of the value, the value of the shape of dark in here. I'm averaging it, and then pushing a few areas, making it a little bit darker. And I'm kind of resisting drawing that edge for now, because I think I want to pop this edge off a little bit more. So I may have to play around with some line work, contort myself a bit here. Just going to see how this plays out. I'm going to drop a line right along this edge. And see if that brings that forward, which I feel like it does. I'm lifting off some of the highlight along in here. But I'm going to take it in chunks. And there's a little bit of contrast in light. So generally this is a light side of the bowl, but it's a little bit stronger right in here. So I'll be able to lift that out. So drop a little bit of tone down there. And see how that reads. I'm gonna sharpen this edge just a bit. And then see where else I can drop it. So now that I have this high contrast in here, this feels really washed out. So I'm going to bring in my darker values again and to provide a little bit more definition in along here. And so as I'm blocking this in, I'm being mindful of the pressure. So really lifting it off on this edge to create a smooth kind of gradation there. And so if it helps, try to think about it as a bit of a rocking motion. So so that you're applying more pressure on the center of each mark versus the ends. And then create some visual separation, again, by, we're looking at the curve here, running the marks here along the ground plane at a different angle than the curve. So if I were to make these marks run this way, it would flatten things out. It gives it's an indicator to the viewer that if the marks here are running in the same direction as the edge of the bowl, they must belong together, so it flattens it out. If they're running in different directions, then your brain says, well, they must be different. So then you can create the illusion of separation that way. And I think I want to sharpen up just this area of the bowl here. This is ultimately becoming about kind of selective focus. There's some areas here, like if we isolate just this area, it's very soft and out of focus. We come over here and it's a little bit sharper. What I want for the whole effect is that you accept the whole thing, almost accept it as being in sharper focus than it actually is. And right now, like this area is really undefined. Let me see if defining it helps it or not. Sometimes you just got to try things out. I think that actually works out okay. What I'm looking at is that, again, that's the spatial definition. Does this avocado fit inside that bowl? Does this rim really wrap around it? And sometimes what I'll do is I'll isolate an area and ask myself, just looking at this shape here, do I get a sense of the spatial relationships between those objects? Or does it require that I see the entire form in this context for me to understand how everything fits together? So that might be helpful in some cases as you're evaluating your work, is you'll now move from section to section and ask yourself, does this make sense visually? And not all the times, but sometimes it can reveal to you an area that might require additional attention, either a softening or bridging of values or greater contrast. But that, we talk about that here before. I haven't talked about it in this show, but it's important to change the context of your work. So change the relationship between you and your drawing. Set it up and walk away from it, flip it upside down, take a photograph of it and look at the thumbnail, hold it up in a mirror. Or this is it's one that I forgot that I used a lot, but just taking a small section of it, moving across the drawing and asking myself, does that make sense? So if I look down here, I can't tell which is in front of which. And so now I can kind of look at the subject matter and say, how can I push that a little bit farther? And actually one thing that comes to mind is actually darkening this area just a little bit more. See what that does. Does that put the avocado in the bowl a little bit more? Does it push it back farther? And then maybe see if I can lift that highlight out a little bit more. And then maybe it's that this is too flat. So what happens if I look for some subtle variations here to really round out that bowl? Now when I go back to this section, does it feel like I understand it as a three-dimensional form a little bit better? I think so. It still might be a little bit abstract. I feel like this comes forward now. But again, it's not always going to reveal something, but it's just another way of looking at your work to see if it reveals something that you may have missed otherwise. Because sometimes we just get locked into perceiving our drawing in a particular way that with time and distance or a recontextualization of your work can reveal something. So Hopefully that makes sense. Zeffy's got to run. Thank you for joining us. All right, we're an hour and 45 minutes in. This has actually been a fairly quick one today. I guess it was a fairly quick drawing, but does anybody see anything in here that needs to be addressed or that you question, want me to try something out in the drawing? It's, sometimes you got to take a risk and try something to see if it's going to work. In this case, I kind of like that I've minimized the environment a little bit, but maybe it could use a little bit more work there. So I'm just going to kind of open it up to you all. How are your drawings going? Are you happy with them? Is there anything that we can help with? I know there's a bit of a delay here, so I'm just kind of patiently waiting to see if there's any questions. All right, well, I think I'm gonna try something. I'm gonna take my harder pencil, and I feel like this, even though I like the light along there, I feel like it's a little bit undefined, so I'm gonna run a light line along in here just to sharpen it up. And see how that works. Kind of like it. See what happens if I do that over here. Brenda said, is there a very small light left behind the front half? I'm not sure I quite understand. Ooh, Greg is saying, how about the little highlight on the base, the bottom of the bowl? Ooh, there's a little bit of reflected light in here. Let me see what happens. Just being really, really sensitive there, because when I squint at the subject, that largely disappears, that area down in here. So I don't want to make sure that I'm not lifting too much, because when I compare it to the subject, I haven't gone quite as dark here. So actually, maybe what would happen if I were to do that? Rather than lift off the light any farther there, I want to go darker here. So just kind of right in the base, kind of feathering that out a little bit. I switch to this tripod grip so I can get a little bit more pressure and really fill in the tooth of the paper. There, I like that defines that. I think it was a good observation there, Greg. And now it makes me feel like this is relatively flat. So what happens if I provide a little bit more volume this way? Sharpen that up a bit. Then I just read Deanne's comment, perhaps darken your values in the bowl, and what Greg said. I think we were on the same page. Well said. And then Cindy's saying the top edges of the avocados need to be a little darker, especially the right one. Oh, yes. Good one. Right in here in particular, it gets quite a bit darker And along this edge, it's almost like, yeah, that's falling into shadow. And then there's that little sliver of light in there. Right in here, it can go darker. Ah, that's what it needed. That's one of the things it needed, at least. Thank you all. Yes, I do like that. And that helps to create some of that light in here that we were kind of battling earlier. I might drop this a little bit more, see what that does. And I feel like this area in here could be darker as well. Push this back a little bit. Much happier. That was a really good comment there. All right, anything else? What else comes to mind? This is why we draw together. There was in one of the Facebook groups that I follow, there's some really interesting dialogue about, feedback on, on social media, but in general. And, one of the things we talk about here a lot in the show is just the value of finding kind of a creative partner who can give you the feedback you need in the way that works for you, right? Sometimes you have to hear uncomfortable truths in order to grow, but there can be also a line there where, an uncomfortable truth delivered the wrong way can just be hurtful, and that doesn't help anybody, right? And there can be an art to asking for feedback and delivering feedback and accepting feedback, right? And so that's one of the things we've talked about here on the show before is that, and why I chose to call the show Drawing Together is because it's in those environments where you feel safe to ask for feedback as well as kind of give it, and kind of know that we're all in a position of trying to grow and evolve. And sometimes it can be clear, it might be helpful to be clear, like how, in what way are you looking to grow? What type of feedback is useful and one of the things that I come down to is, for me, what's important is the feedback going to inspire somebody to continue to make work? Or could it have the potential of shutting somebody down and just say, well, screw it, I don't want to do this. And I have been really encouraged by the feedback I get here in this group because it's by and large been positive. There's so much stuff on the internet, that we can get, you get people saying all sorts of hurtful things to one another, and I have been lucky to have had very little of that, and I appreciate that all from you. So this I think needs to be a little bit darker in here as well. So here I'm going to play a little bit of positive and negative space, see what happens. I'm enhancing this edge by, this is relatively dark, but I'm going to go darker next to it to see what that does to the form. Kind of create a little bit of reflected light. And I don't like that. That really kind of popped that edge forward and almost feels like it's in front of this edge. There, I think that helped to push it back a little bit. All right, I'm just going to try something here along this edge. I'm going to see if I can create a little bit more volume in here by darkening right in along here, that inner edge. This is part of that bowl that's really receding away from us almost perpendicularly. So if I create a contrast in value here. Does that convey that or not? I don't know. I think maybe like right along here. Let me see what happens if I kind of switch direction of my marks. I think that might actually help a little bit more. Let's see. All right, darken the inside of the bowl, maybe. Ah, mad moments go. Yes. Yeah, definitely right in there. I think I missed your comments there, mad moments go. So, and I know I've made some changes here. So, I don't. If you're still seeing a specific area that could be darkened, see what happens if I push that. I darkened it and then had to darken the avocado to create that contrast. How does that work? Now we're down to like the little things, but sometimes it's little things that can make it all come together. So, Drag is saying the shadow at the bottom of the rear avocado to continue pushing it back some, and the dark value where the two meet in the bowl. Oh yes, yeah, like right in here. What's happening? I think you're seeing it is this bit of a tangent where we have this contour here aligning with the contour of the bowl, and that's flattening out. And so by darkening this space here, we're breaking that up a little bit more. Let me see what happens. Steven Abramson says, looks a little light on the bottom avocado where they meet at the front. Oh, right in here, I think maybe. Yeah, that's a softer edge. I kind of made that a sharper one. So, what if I do that? This is awesome. Yeah, what I like about darkening there is it helps to pop that light in along in here a little bit more. And this is where I think what you're all seeing is the effect of my kind of misinterpretation of the value based on the color that I'm seeing. For whatever reason, I'm looking at that brighter green avocado and I'm interpreting it as a lighter value than it actually is. And so as you're pointing that out, it's helping me to recontextualize the value relationships. And yeah, and I think what you're seeing, like what I've kind of stopped doing is really comparing one half to the other. If I focus on here but put my awareness on this, I realize that this is actually quite a bit darker in value than this. And I almost feel like I've made this a little bit too light. See what happens if I just drop this down. And maybe just pull this light out a little bit more. I'm going to reestablish that, but just a little bit more subtle. Yeah, I feel like that works out a little bit better. Jackie's saying, thanks God, I think it looks good, great. And while we can pick and pick at our work, at some point it's done. You're right. It's hard to know. Sometimes you just got to stop. All right. But this has been, I am really glad that I got some of those suggestions from you all. Because I do think it's helped improve the drawing. Now I'm just kind of going back and forth. And I might just play let me just play a little bit and see what happens. I do feel like this needs to be darker to create a stronger interaction between light and dark. You know, so this becomes lighter, that becomes darker, this becomes darker than that. And then maybe a little bit. If I darken this a little bit more, what does that do? Yeah, Deanna is saying that you love that eraser. Is it the Derwent one? I love this one too. Actually, all of these. This Vanish eraser is really awesome too. I finally, I think, settled into a nice arrangement. I mean, I do have a general philosophy that good drawing is good drawing, and you never want to not draw because you don't have the right materials. But sometimes when you get some materials that you really align with, it's really nice. All right, how's that? Just gonna push the shadow a little bit more, just drop the whole thing. I don't know. Whew. So many ways we can kind of tweak this. And that's part of the learning process too, is knowing, if we're treating each drawing as an opportunity to grow and really kind of an exercise, then, sometimes you just got to push it a little bit farther than you might feel comfortable with. Sometimes you've extracted everything from it that you can, and it's time to pack it up and move on to the next one. But you never know. There, I feel better about that. I kind of like what's happening in here from a mark making perspective, but I'm not sure it's working value wise. Let me see if that works better. I think that works okay now. All right. Jonah's saying the Cezanne pencils are a dream. Yes, I agree. I really like these pencils. I've enjoyed the Derwent ones that I've worked with as well. Let's see. Hey, Mad Moments Go is saying a little light on the bottom of the seed that looks like a walnut. Not sure I understand, but I'm going to sharpen this up. Sometimes what I'll do is I've got this sharp eraser and I just need to sharpen up the edge, but I don't want to lift off too much material, so I'll just kind of press and lift, kind of just give it a little shake. That could sometimes be enough to sharpen up an edge. A few little marks to help define that a little bit. All right, but I think we're just about out of time. I'll pack it in. I want to thank you all. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate the feedback, the suggestions and where to look. I think that really did make a big impact, have a big impact on the way the drawing came together. Overall, I'm happy with it. I think there's always still ways that we can improve, but that's why we have next week. So we're working on a portrait next week. Do I have it? No. Oh, I do. Somewhere. This was the practice I was doing. Working on this portrait for next week. So I'm gonna work on this a little bit more, but yeah, we're gonna switch from avocados to portraits. That's what we do here in the show. So hopefully you'll join us again next week, 3 p.m. Eastern. Again, this is Drawing Together with Artists Network. I want to thank you all for joining us. I'll be posting all the information about this upcoming one soon, so that you can prepare. I think we're just going to be doing graphite, but a lot of these assignments are not, I don't want to call them, a lot of these projects are designed for you to apply any material to. So You don't have to worry about following me directly. That's not what this is all about. I would love to see you take your own path through this drawing with the materials that really connect with you. But I'll be working with graphite next week. If you're new, I want to thank you for joining us and welcome you. And Susan is saying, I'm a bit new to this series, and I was looking at some past episodes where you mentioned silver point. Ooh, you've been using silver point for quite a few years. That's amazing. I've only used it a little bit, and it's hard. I mean, literally it's hard. That's what makes it challenging. So way to go. I would love to see if you have any and you wanted to share it. You could even post it to this episode page on Artist Network. Again, the link to that page is in the description below. You don't have to just post only this subject matter, this drawing. I've seen a lot of people post variations. It's helpful if it's somewhat related, but I really want to see your silver point work. That sounds really cool. Yes, I love seeing the Ingres silver points. Amazing work. All right, so thank you all. I appreciate it. Have a great week. Have a great weekend. Happy drawing, and we'll see you next week.